Chapter 1. The Two Sisters. It was the year 1757. The place was the dangerous and wild land west of the Hudson River. It was the 3rd year of the war in North America. The war was between England and France. Each country wanted the land for itself. Indian tribes had always lived in that land. In the war, some tribes were fighting for the French, other tribes were fighting for the English. Fort Edward was on the Hudson River. General Webb was the commander of the English army at Fort Edward. He was waiting for news of General Montcalm. Montcalm was the commander of the French army. The news came one morning. An Indian called Magua arrived.
Montcalm and the French army are coming towards Fort William Henry,
Magua told General Webb. Fort William Henry was 15 miles away. It was at the south end of Lake Horican.
"How many men has Montcalm got?"
asked Webb.
"As many as the leaves on the trees," said Magua. "General Monroe wants more soldiers at Fort William Henry."
"I will send 1,500 men," said General Webb. General Monroe was the commander of the English army at Fort William Henry. He had 2 daughters, Cora and Alice. Cora was about 23 years old, and Alice was 18. Cora had dark hair and a beautiful face. Alice had fair hair and blue eyes. These 2 young women were at Fort Edward, but they were going to travel to Fort William Henry. They were going to meet their father. General Webb spoke to Cora and Alice. "Magua knows a secret path through the forest," said General Webb. "He will be your guide. Magua and Major Duncan Hayward will take you to Fort William Henry." Major Duncan Hayward was a young English officer. He and the 2 young women left Fort Edward. They rode on horses. Magua walked in front of them. Alice watched Magua. "I don't like him, Cora," she said. "What do you think? Will we be safe in the forest with Magua?" "We must trust Magua," said Cora. "The French know our soldiers' paths," said Duncan, "but Magua's path is secret." He smiled at Alice, and she smiled at him. Duncan Hayward was in love with Alice. "Magua is a Huron," said Duncan, "but he lived with the Mohawks. The Mohawks are friends of the English. Magua came to us. Your father—" Duncan stopped. Then he said, "But I don't remember all the story." Duncan knew more about Magua, but he did not tell Cora and Alice. He did not say, "A few years ago your father's men beat Magua. Now Magua hates your father." Duncan did not want to frighten the young women. So they followed Magua through the forest. Chapter 2. Lost in the Forest. A few miles west of Fort Edward, 3 men were sitting near a river. 2 of the men were Indians. The other was a white man. Chingachgook and his son Uncas were Mohicans. The white man was a scout called Hawkeye. Hawkeye had a long hunting gun. The 3 men were talking.
"My tribe is the oldest Indian tribe,"
Chingachgook said.
The blood of the Mohican chiefs is in me. Many summers ago, my tribe came here to the land of the Delawares.
Where are the Mohicans now? Asked Hawkeye.
Where are the flowers of those summers?
Said Chingachgook.
Gone, all dead. After my death, Uncas will be the last of the Mohicans.
Suddenly they heard a noise. They turned quickly. Hawkeye lifted his gun. "Who is it?" he said. Duncan Hayward rode out of the forest. Cora and Alice followed him. "I am an English officer," Duncan said. "We have come from Fort Edward. How far is it to Fort William Henry?" Hawkeye laughed. "Fort William Henry? You are going the wrong way," he said. "You are near Glens Falls." "The wrong way?" said Duncan. "Then we are lost. But our Indian guide—" "You have an Indian guide, but you are lost in the forest?" said Hawkeye. "That is very strange. Is he a Delaware?" "He is called Magua. He is a Huron," said Duncan. "But he lives with the Mohawks, and he is a guide for the "A Huron," said Hawkeye quickly. "You can trust a Mohican or a Delaware, but you cannot trust a Huron. Your guide will lead you to his friends. They will kill you. Let me see him." Magua was standing behind Cora's horse. Hawkeye looked at him. Then he went and spoke to Chingachgook and Uncas. Magua moved quickly. He ran into the forest. Hawkeye, Chingachgook, and Uncas ran after him. But Magua escaped. "What can I do?" thought Duncan. "We are lost." He turned to Hawkeye. "Will you take us to Fort William Henry?" he asked. "We will give you money." Hawkeye looked at Cora and Alice. "We will take you," he told Duncan. "Money is not important. We will not leave you and the two young women here. Magua and his Huron friends will find you. Come now, quickly." Duncan and Hawkeye spoke to Cora and Alice. The sisters got off their horses. The Mohicans took the animals away. "They will hide the horses until the morning," said Hawkeye. He pulled a canoe from the tall grass at the side of the river. "Get into the canoe," he said. "We will go to a cave, and we will stay there tonight." Duncan, Cora, and Alice got into the canoe. Hawkeye pushed the canoe to the middle of the river. Then he got into the canoe. He started to paddle along the river. Soon they heard the sound of a great waterfall in front of them, Glens Falls. A few minutes later, they saw the waterfall. Hawkeye paddled the canoe close to the great waterfall. Alice was afraid. She closed her eyes. Hawkeye stopped the canoe by a large, flat rock. Cora, Alice, and Duncan got out of the canoe. "Wait on the flat rock," Hawkeye said to them. "I will bring the Mohicans." A few minutes later, Hawkeye came back with Chingachgook and Uncas. The scout led everybody to a cave behind the waterfall. The cave was deep and narrow and dark. Hawkeye immediately made a fire. Alice looked at the tall young Mohican, Uncas. "A strong man is guarding us," she said quietly to her sister. "We will be safe tonight." Chapter 3. The Fight at Glens Falls. Hawkeye woke Duncan early the next morning. "We must go," he said. "I will get the canoe. Wake Miss Cora and Miss Alice. but do not make any noise." Duncan went to the back of the cave. "Cora! Alice!" he said quietly. "Wake up!" Suddenly there were shouts and cries outside. Duncan ran to the front of the cave. The sound of guns came from the forest. There were many Indians on the other side of the river. "Hurons," thought Duncan. Then Duncan saw Hawkeye. The scout was shooting from the flat rock. Duncan saw a Huron fall into the rushing water. Then the other Hurons ran back into the forest. Hawkeye came back into the cave. "They have gone," he said. "Will they come back?" asked Duncan. "Yes, they will come back," replied Hawkeye. "Miss Cora and Miss Alice must stay here in the cave. We will go to the rocks and wait for the Hurons." Duncan, Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook sat with their guns. They sat behind some rocks near the waterfall. They waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour passed. Suddenly they heard the wild cries of the Hurons again. 4 Indians ran across the flat rock towards the cave. Chingachgook and Uncas fired their guns. The first 2 Hurons fell to the ground. The third Huron jumped on Hawkeye. Each man had a knife, but Hawkeye was stronger than the Huron. He killed the Huron with his knife. The 4th Huron fought with Duncan. Uncas ran to help the officer. The young Mohican killed the Huron. Then Uncas and Duncan ran back to the rocks. The Hurons on the other side of the river started to shoot again, and Chingachgook shot at them. The shooting went on and on. Rocks and trees near the cave were broken in 100 places, but Hawkeye and his friends were not hurt. And Cora and Alice were safe in the cave. Hawkeye saw a Huron in a tree on the other side of the river. The scout lifted his long gun and fired. There was a cry, and the Indian fell from the tree. "I have no more bullets," said Hawkeye. "Uncas, go to the canoe. There are some bullets in the canoe." Uncas ran quickly across the flat rock, but he was too late. A Huron was pushing the canoe across the river. Duncan, Hawkeye, and the 2 Mohicans went back to the cave. "What can we do now?" asked Duncan. Hawkeye thought for a few minutes. "There will be guards on the paths," he said. "The Hurons will watch every path. We must swim. We must jump into the river. The rushing water will take us past the Hurons." The scout looked at Cora and Alice. "We cannot swim," said Cora. "Alice and I will stay here. Go to General Monroe at Fort William Henry. General Monroe must send soldiers." Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye talked quietly together. Then Chingachgook ran out of the cave and jumped into the river. A moment later, Hawkeye put down his long gun and followed Chingachgook. The rushing water took them away. Cora looked at Uncas. "Go with them," she said. "I will stay," said the young Mohican. "No," said Cora. "Please, Uncas, go with them." Uncas was unhappy, but he jumped into the water too. Cora looked at Duncan. "I am going to stay," said Duncan. He looked at Alice. "I cannot leave you." There were shouts and cries from the Hurons on the flat rock. Duncan looked out of the cave. The Hurons were looking behind the rocks near the waterfall. They are looking for us, thought Duncan. He went quickly back into the cave. Our friends will bring help soon, he said to Cora and Alice. Cora was afraid. Her face was white. She cried out. Duncan turned, and he saw the terrible face of Magua.
"Where are the Mohicans?"
asked Magua.
"Where is the scout, Hawkeye, the long gun?"
Suddenly the cave was full of Hurons. One of them picked up Hawkeye's gun. "They have gone," said Duncan. "They will bring help soon." The Hurons were angry. They were going to kill their prisoners. But Magua spoke to them quickly and quietly. Then the Hurons took Duncan, Cora, and Alice to the flat rock. One of the Hurons brought the canoe.
"Get into the canoe,"
Magua said. Duncan and the sisters got into the canoe. Magua and the Hurons took them across the river. The prisoners got out of the canoe on the other side of the river. Magua and 5 Hurons stayed with them. The other Hurons walked away into the forest. Chapter 4. I am a Huron Chief. The Hurons and their prisoners started to walk. Magua walked in front of Duncan, Cora, and Alice. The other Hurons walked behind the prisoners. They walked across a valley. Then Magua led them up a steep hill. The land at the top of the hill was flat. Magua sat down under a tree. The Hurons started to eat and drink. Magua shouted to Duncan,
"Send the dark-haired woman to me."
Cora was afraid. She went to Magua. "What do you want?" she asked.
"I am a Huron chief," said Magua. "I lived 20 summers and 20 winters. I did not see a white man. I was happy. Then a white man came to the forest. He gave me brandy. The drink was bad for me. It made me crazy. My people were angry. I had to go away. I ran away and lived with the Mohawks. Then the war started," said Magua. "The French and the English were fighting each other. The Mohawks were fighting for the English. The Hurons were fighting for the French. I was fighting my own people. Your father, Monroe, was our chief. He told the Mohawks, 'Do not drink brandy.' But a white man gave me brandy. What did Monroe do? He gave orders to his men. They tied me with ropes, and they beat me. I will never forget."
"But," said Cora.
"Woman!"
shouted Magua. He stood up quickly.
"You will be my wife. Your sister will go to Fort William Henry. She must tell Monroe everything. Then Monroe will know. His daughter lives with me, Magua."
"Never," said Cora. "I will not be your wife." Magua smiled.
"Then you will die," he said. "And your friends will die too."
Then Magua went towards the other Hurons. He spoke to them. Duncan ran to Cora. "What is wrong?" he asked. "What did Magua say to you?" "It is not important," said Cora. The Hurons were listening to Magua. Duncan watched them. They were very angry. Suddenly Magua shouted at the Hurons. They pulled Duncan and the women towards the trees. They tied each prisoner to a tree with rope. Magua stood in front of Cora. He laughed.
"What does Monroe's daughter say now?" he said. "Shall I send your sister to your father? Will you follow me to the Great Lakes and live with me?"
Cora looked at her sister. "Alice," said Cora, "I must go with Magua and be his wife. Then you and Duncan will live."
"No!" shouted Duncan. "Never!"
"No, no, no," said Alice.
"Then die!"
shouted Magua. He threw his knife at Alice. The knife cut off some of her hair. It hit the tree above her head. Duncan shouted angrily. The Hurons had tied Duncan to a tree, but he pulled the rope and it broke. He jumped on a Huron and they fought. The Huron had a knife. He was going to kill Duncan. Suddenly a gun fired, and the Huron fell dead.